Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Today we're going to be talking about cell theory and structure. So we're just going to begin talking about different types of cells. So the discovery of the cell. Basically scientists had not actually invented microscopes until the mid-1600s. And Robert Hooke was one of the first people to use an early microscope to look at slices of cork. And this is what he saw. And if you look, you can kind of see that there are these little compartments in here, right? These little sort of almost look like cells of a prison. So he named these empty chambers cells because they kind of look like cells of a prison. And that's sort of where this idea of a cell comes from. There was also another guy, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and he was using a single cell microscope to observe unicellular organisms in pond water. So he was actually seeing them kind of move around and things. Now there's this pretty cool website, and I will link this in the description down below, that sort of gives you an idea of the cell size and scale. So really, how big is a cell? So we're kind of starting out here. We are looking at Times Regular 12-point font. A coffee bean is going to be 12 by 8 millimeters. And as we kind of move the slider over, we can zoom in. A grain of salt is going to be 1/2 millimeter. All right, and then we get down here. Okay, so our first type of cell is going to be an amoeba, and that's 500 micrometers. You kind of get a little closer. You see a human egg cell is only 130 micrometers. Right? Getting a little closer, photoreceptors. Those are in your eyes. There's a skin cell, 30 micrometers. Sperm, 60 by 5 micrometers. Your red blood cells, only 8 micrometers, very, very small. And you'll notice that they're not that much bigger than the X chromosome. So red blood cells actually do not have any DNA in them, which is kind of interesting. Yeast is a fungus. Look, it's getting even smaller. All right, and notice, all right, so now we're here, down here to E. coli bacteria. That's in your stomach. Those are about the same size as a mitochondria, so you can see why prokaryotes don't actually have mitochondria inside of them, and this is going to be important a little bit later on in this video. Lysosomes are another organelle. They're about 1 micrometer. All right, and here's your viruses. So you can see how small viruses are compared to cells, right? Especially bacterial cells. Much, much smaller. There's HIV, influenza, hepatitis. The rhinovirus gives you the common cold. There's a ribosome. All right, here's an antibody. We're now getting down into the nanometers. Some tRNA. We'll learn about that later on. Hemoglobin. All right, so there's your hemoglobin, and then we zoom back out. There's our red blood cells, so very, very small. All right. And phospholipids. Phospholipids are what are found in the cell membrane. There's a glucose molecule, adenine, which is a nucleotide, methionine, which is an amino acid. You see all these things are very, very small. And we're getting down here finally to a carbon atom, which is 340 picometers. So we can kind of see and zoom back out how small cells are compared to the world around us. So additional observations of cells over the years have basically come to 3 things, and we call this cell theory. Number 1, all living things are composed of cells. So if you're not living, you're not composed of cells, which is part of the reason why viruses are not considered living. They're not made of cells. Cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things. So you start off with a cell and build up from there. Just like in chemistry, the basic unit is the atom. And new cells are produced from existing cells. You can't have a cell just come out of nowhere. Now, this kind of leads us to some issues of where did the first cell come from, and we'll discuss that more once we get to our evolution unit. So there are 2 categories of cells. We've got prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are the original cells, and then eukaryotes are newer cells. The eukaryote means true cell. This is what the U means. So prokaryotes, they don't have a nucleus. Eukaryotes, they do have a nucleus, so they have that defined area that the DNA stays in. Prokaryotes don't really have many organelles, and they have no membrane-bound organelles. We'll talk about what that means in just a little bit. Whereas eukaryotes, they have many membrane-bound organelles. Prokaryotes are very small as compared to eukaryotes, which are larger, which again we saw in that demonstration. And And yeah, that's kind of the basic outline of the two. Eukaryotes are going to be humans, plants, and fungi. Prokaryotes are going to be things like bacteria. So cell structure. All cells, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, have DNA and a cell membrane. That's just kind of the basic outline. Cells also contain organelles, and that means little organ. So they're basically just they're like organs in our bodies, but they're small and specialized structures within a cell that perform particular tasks. And the organelles float around inside the cell's cytoplasm, which is the space in between the cell membrane and in eukaryotes the nucleus and in prokaryotes the DNA, and it's mostly made up of water. So prokaryotes, again, they're very simple. They only have a few basic structures. DNA, the cell or plasma membrane, it's the same thing, they're just two different names, so make sure if you see one, just recognize that they mean the same thing. They have a cell wall, and that is going to add some extra protection along the outsides. They have ribosomes to produce proteins. And some use structures like pili, cili, and flagellum to move an aquatic virus. So here's what that flagella looks like. These are the pili. But they come in a lot of different varieties. And the bacteria and viruses notes, you'll kind of see some of those different varieties. Eukaryotes are much more complex, and they can be either multicellular or unicellular. Multicellular just means that they work together in larger groups. So we are multicellular because we're made up of many cells, but they can also be unicellular, just the one. And they contain many organelles. So let's talk about all these different organelles because it's going to be important that you understand the structure and how they relate to one another. So this is what regulates what enters and leaves the cell, and I believe that you all already know this one. This is the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. The cell membrane is made up of phospholipids, a phospholipid bilayer. So remember, our lipids contains kind of a hydrogen area, an oxygen area, and a long chain of carbon. So they end up being two kind of areas, one that is water-loving and one that is water-hating, and we'll talk more about that when we start talking about how the plasma membrane sort of regulates what comes in and out of the cell. But basically it creates a layer of two opposing forces that kind of hold the cell together, which is pretty cool. So this is what that kind of looks like. So this is the peptidoglycan, and this would be a bacterial cell. So this would be the cell wall right here, and then you've got the cytoplasmic membrane on the inside right here, and then here you've got the cytoplasm. So this is what the nucleus, and the nucleus is what controls the cell because that's where the DNA is stored. And remember, DNA contains the instructions for what cells are going to be doing. So that's located here in the middle. It's usually the most prominent feature in a cell. So here is the nucleus, rather large as you can see. This would be an animal cell, and we can tell because it doesn't have a very strong structure. These right here are going to be some mitochondria. All these long things, this is rough ER, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So your ribosomes are what are going to be assembling your proteins. They're going to put them together, and we're going to talk a lot about ribosomes once we get into our next unit with DNA, because protein assemblage is one of the major things that we're going to learn about in biology. But your ribosomes are made up of two units. They have a large subunit and a small subunit, and they actually kind of come together in order to do their function. This is the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, the endoplasmic reticulum has two types. You've got the rough ER, which contains ribosomes that produce proteins, but then you've also have the smooth ER, which contains specialized enzymes and makes lipid components for the cell membrane, so it actually helps to maintain the cell membrane. And this is what the rough ER looks like. You can see it kind of snakes around, and it's got all these ribosomes, little black dots, attached to it. We also have something called the Golgi apparatus. It sorts, modifies, and packages proteins that are created in the endoplasmic reticulum for storage or secretion from the cell. So what it'll do is that when something is created in the rough endoplasmic reticulum, it'll kind of surround it and then send out a little capsule of that substance out of the cell, or it will just create a capsule and just kind of hold on to it for later use. This is what the Golgi apparatus looks like. Pretty cool. And you can kind of see here, these are these little capsules here. We also got lysosomes and peroxisomes. Your lysosomes contain enzymes that are specialized to digest lipids, carbs, and proteins so that their monomers can be reused. So they basically break them down. So when your cells bring stuff in, it breaks it down so that then they can recombine them. And then you've got your peroxisomes. Your peroxisomes kind of protect the cell from toxic materials. So they have enzymes that if the cell ingests something toxic, it can break those down into the components so that it doesn't hurt the cell. And this is kind of what the lysosomes look like there. Again, these are the membrane-bound organelles, so you can see that they have a membrane around the outside. Same thing with the Golgi apparatus. So this is what we're talking about. Prokaryotes do not have these because they have the membranes around them. We also have the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is kind of a network of protein filaments that basically acts like the structure of a cell. So like it's kind of like the frame of your house. It just kind of helps maintain the shape. It can also help them move. So those cells that move around, the microfilaments help with that motion. Kind of like our skeleton gives us something for our muscles to pivot on. The cytoskeleton gives your cells something to pivot on when it's trying to move. So this is the nucleus. Here's the nuclear membrane, and then here's sort of the cytoskeleton. Pretty cool. So the mitochondria is generally referred to as the powerhouse of the cell because this is where cellular respiration will occur. So it provides the cell with usable chemical energy, and we're going to spend more time talking about that later on in this unit. But the mitochondria is this one right here. And when we look at it up close, we can kind of see that there are all these folds. These folds are used to increase surface area so that more cellular respiration can occur. So it's a very unique and prominent structure, and whenever you see something that kind of has these like wavy folds in it, you should always think of that as the mitochondria. All right, now let's take a look at these two cells. What is kind of the main differences we see here? One of the main differences we see is that this is kind of a rounder, not very geometrical shape, whereas this has got a more geometric shape, right? We also see that there's a large vacuole here. We don't really see that here. And then finally, we've got these organelles right here. These are our chloroplasts. So this right here is going to be a plant cell, and this over here is an animal cell. And we need to be able to recognize the difference between the two. So plant cells have some special features that animal cells don't. For example, they have chloroplasts, which create usable energy through the process of photosynthesis. Again, we're going to be spending more time talking about photosynthesis later on. They also have cell walls that provide the cell with rigid structure. Bacteria cells, remember, also have cell walls, but they are made up of a different substance. It's not in cells, that is cellulose and not peptidoglycan. And plant cells have one large vacuole used for the storage of water and other important materials. And this is kind of what gives plant cells their shape and helps them hold up. So plants, they don't have a skeleton like we do. They use their cell walls in order to hold themselves up, and they fill their large vacuole with water in order to maintain that shape. That's why plants wilt when they aren't watered. It's because there's not enough water inside to keep the pressure on the cell walls, and so it kind of collapses in on itself. Animal cells do have vacuoles. They're just generally small. This is what a plant cell looks like. Here's that large vacuole. You've got your cell wall right here. And then these are going to be our chloroplasts. And you look here, there's these kind of dark structures that are kind of stacked on top of one another. Those are called thylakoid stacks. That's where the actual photosynthesis is occurring, and that's where the light is absorbed. It's important not necessarily that you know that they're thylakoid stacks, but that you be able to recognize the structure. So what you kind of see is kind of three stacks, or stacks of these kind of discs, green discs on top of one another, and that would be an indicator that that would be a chloroplast. And again, here's an animal cell. Kind of see the differences in the shape, right? A little bit more geometrical, huge vacuole. Here we've got our nucleus, okay, some centrioles, and we'll talk about what those do later on. The Golgi apparatus is right here. Lots of mitochondria, right? the membranes around the outside, and then some lysosomes. And here's some of the smaller vacuoles. Now, what is kind of interesting here is that some organelles have their own DNA, which is kind of weird to think about, but they have their own separate DNA apart from the nucleus. So only two do. That's the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. So the idea is that we have this theory called endosymbiotic theory, which suggests that mitochondria and chloroplasts are the descendants of ancient prokaryotes that developed symbiotic relationships with ancient cells. So what happened essentially is that mitochondria and chloroplasts were prokaryotes, and they were engulfed by a ancestral eukaryote, and over time they just kind of lived together, and they eventually, when one cell replicated, the other one would replicate until now they just are all a part of the same cell. Now, let's think about this, okay? When you have a multicellular animal like ourselves, okay, what this is saying is nearly all the MT, that's mitochondrial DNA, in a fertilized egg is inherited only from the mother, and that makes sense, right? Egg cells are much larger than sperm cells. Sperm cells don't really have that much mitochondria as compared to an egg cell. So what we can do is we can trace the mitochondrial DNA through lineages. So we can start off with following mothers, and we can follow them all the way down through the ages. And it's really a useful tool in terms of figuring out the descendants of people and where they came from originally. So yeah, that was the simple dilution. So an egg cell contains, 100,000 to a million mitochondria. A sperm cell only contains 10 to 100. So most of that is going to be coming from the egg cell, which is going to be coming from the mother. So again, here's sort of what a chloroplast looks like. Again, you've got these kind of stacks of green things. Those are your thylakoids. And again, we kind of want to just be able to recognize this structure. Same thing with the mitochondria. We've got these kind of twists and turns that increase surface area. We want to be able to recognize that as a mitochondria. All right, that's all I got, and I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time.